Hello guys, how are you doing? This is Rob of Rule of Two Review. Welcome back to the channel, and today I want to discuss video game remakes and whether or not they're inherently lazy when it comes to the developers and the amount of effort they're putting into them. So I have to say that after a week off, it feels really good to be back. Most of you guys who watched my last video probably already know I did take this past week off. I had my younger brother in town visiting me and staying with my girlfriend and I, and so that obviously kept us pretty busy, and it made it so that I wasn't able to upload any videos. Not a lot of huge news was breaking throughout the week anyway, so that definitely made it pretty easy to kind of step away from the YouTube bracket for a little bit. And as much as we really liked the idea of doing some sort of video or a live Q&A or something with my brother and kind of get him on camera so you guys could meet him as well, it just didn't make sense. We were just spending too much time together doing normal stuff that it didn't make sense. So either way, that being said, now that I'm back to the normal kind of thing, I thought that this was going to be an interesting topic to discuss because I was actually inspired to do so by IGN's Game Scoop podcast. So I was listening to their most recent episode earlier today while I was working, and in it there was a question that they received from a fan about video game remakes, obviously in lieu of the fact that Zelda Link's Awakening was recently released on the Nintendo Switch, a pretty darn good game if I do say so myself. And this listener was really just kind of probing them for their overall thoughts on the idea of video game remakes. And while I did mention to you in the intro here that I'm kind of discussing whether or not they're lazy from the developer's perspective, this person didn't really touch on that too much in their question, but it was kind of implied. And listening to that question and the response of everyone on the podcast, it just got my brain thinking as well about this topic, because we've seen a lot of pretty significant remakes over the years and decades in gaming. Most of them pretty darn good remakes, usually well received, usually a lot of hype and excitement surrounding them, and I think that that's really great. And so I started to think about what was kind of being implied in this person's question about whether or not game developers are missing opportunities for new games. That was kind of really the crux of the question being asked, is whether or not a remake makes sense when they otherwise could have been putting the resources and money and manpower into just a new game in XYZ franchise. And it definitely was a good question, and I think that there's a lot of merit on both sides, and with Link's Awakening just released and another smaller tier remake just around the corner, it just made me want to discuss this. So on the whole, just surface level before I dive into the whole development situation with developers and the amount of effort they put into their games, as far as remakes go, I just want to say, blanket statement, I like remakes. I like the idea of video game remakes. Like I already even said here today, I've mostly enjoyed the ones that I've played, and I think for the most part, they usually turn out pretty well, and they satisfy people. So I have no real problem with a developer or a company taking a classic, loved game and giving it a whole new makeover and re-releasing it. Obviously, it's also important to kind of note the distinction between a remake and a remaster, right? Those are two very, very different things, and I think that sometimes the lines get blurred and people maybe get a little bit confused on which is what counts as a remake, what counts as a remaster. And as far as I've always looked at it, a remaster is just taking a game as it always was, the way it looks, and just giving it kind of a cleaner, neater, nicer looking shine. I've kind of used that phrasing before. A nicer shine or a polish or a sheen to the graphics. Usually we're talking about HD, right? HD remaster. Resident Evil 0 was released on the GameCube in standard definition, but then they re-released it years later on the current consoles, and now it's HD. So it's sharpened up, it's high definition quality, there's a lot of anti-aliasing going on, sometimes maybe the lighting or textures are kind of updated here and there, and it just overall looks like a more modern, cleaner experience. They've done it with other games from those weird eras like God of War, for example. And it's just a very specific look that marries the way the game originally looked with a slightly more appealing, cleaner look to it now. But a remake is obviously a whole different ballgame. That is literally just borderline rebuilding a game. I mean, I don't 100% know that that's how developers go about it, because spoiler alert, I'm not a game developer, but as far as what the end product always feels like, it feels like they really didn't do anything to the original game as it was, but that they almost just rebuilt it, but in the image and in the essence of what the original game was, but using an entirely different new set of assets and visuals and graphics and concepts and all sorts of stuff. I mean, there's been plenty of big ones released throughout the years, like I said. Link's Awakening being a recent one. Medieval, of course, comes out pretty soon. People kind of forget that that's one that's on the horizon, but those are two very current, relevant ones. The original Medieval game from the PlayStation 1 coming out on October 25th in just a couple of weeks. There's been two very famous Metroid remakes. Obviously, those are two that are very near and dear to my heart. Metroid Samus Returns in 2017, and then, of course, Metroid Zero Mission. I think sometimes people forget it. You know, those games both being 2D like the original is great, but they were completely redone. I mean, and there was a ton of new content and new abilities and new items and stuff thrown into those games. Hell, Metroid Zero Mission had an entire new ending tacked onto it. So those are great remakes. Shadow of the Colossus released last year for the PlayStation 4, built from the ground up. Absolutely beautiful. It was essentially a new game while still being the same game. Both Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2 got remakes. You know, Resident Evil 1 was released in, 2002 for the GameCube, one of my favorite Resident Evil games, and Resident Evil 2 released earlier this year. And we also have Final Fantasy VII, a small little game you might have heard of, getting what we think is part one of many to release early next year in 2020. That is going to be one of, if not maybe the most significant actual remake of a game I've ever seen. I mean, and bear in mind, I've not played the original Final Fantasy VII, so I don't have that level of knowledge to state that it's one of the most significant remakes. It's just kind of obvious, right? When you look at what that game was, some of the stuff that I even know about it, and the fact that it is so different from the original, and that they're supposedly releasing it in multiple parts, means that they're really stretching this thing out, so I think it's going to be pretty significant. I mean, Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes on the GameCube is another one. The list kind of goes on, but these are just some of the big ones that really come to my head. Obviously, of course, including those two Metroid games, which are two of my favorite games of all time. And so that's the remake situation. They're just a whole new game that is basically inspired by and built on the foundation of what the original release was. Completely different from a remaster. And I definitely like remasters as well, right? We're used to getting remasters. They're just a common thing nowadays in games, and I think that we've all grown accustomed to them. And those also tend to release to pretty decent fanfare. People seem to like those. But remakes, I don't know. They may not be for everybody, but I just can't think of any of them. All the ones I listed here, all of the ones that I've personally played, I've loved them all. They're always great. They always get me excited, and it's this great combination of playing something nostalgic and familiar to you that makes you reminisce on the past when you originally played it, but also feels like it's a brand new game that's bringing and adding something new. On the surface, it's because it looks so different, but beyond that, like I said, many of them tend to bring in new ideas and new gameplay. But what about the development of these games? What about the developers and the companies behind them? And what about the level of effort and care and passion being put into them? Is a remake of a game a sign that the developer behind it was just being lazy? Were they avoiding the effort and the care that's needing to go into creating a new game, a new entry in whatever that franchise is, just to make something that seems like it's a simple, quick, easy cash grab because it's a game that already exists? Link's Awakening is already a game, so doing a remake is just going to cost less and it's going to require less, and we're just going to make more money because we invest less money in it, and so we make more money back when we sell it. You know, is that really what's going on? And while there's a small case to be said that, yeah, there's maybe a bit of, quote, laziness at play, overall, I'm actually going to say no. I don't think that most remakes that I've ever seen released, that I've ever played, or the couple coming up soon that we know to release, have ever given me any sign that shows me that the developers are lazy. Because remakes, you know, like I've already laid out here, they clearly require a lot of effort. Remember, remakes aren't remasters. A remaster is more of a developer being lazy situation, but I can't say the same for a remake. I don't feel like Capcom was being lazy by not yet putting out Resident Evil 8 and instead putting out the Resident Evil 2 remake. Because as somebody who played Resident Evil 2 and loves that game, I can tell you that playing Resident Evil 2 now on the 2019 remake felt like close to a new game. It was pretty tried and true to a lot of the core elements of that game. I think some people maybe do confuse how much is new in Resident Evil 2. There's not a whole lot of new in it, but there's so much going on in that game, and they did so much to it. Same with Link's Awakening, same with Samus Returns. Samus Returns, in my opinion, one of the best examples of a remake with tons of new stuff, and Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, another great one with tons of new stuff. The Resident Evil 1 remake, tons of new stuff. And so when a company is setting out to make a remake, yeah, we want the next Zelda, we want the next Metal Gear, we want the next whatever, Metroid, obviously, but they clearly have to put so much effort and care and craft into rebuilding and remaking a game compared to remastering it that I don't think that most developers are taking the lazy way out. Not to mention that I firmly believe in most cases with most games getting remakes, I think that typically new games or new entries in that respective franchise are still on the horizon anyway. I mean, we just had a Metal Gear Solid not that long ago, so if they made another Metal Gear Solid game as a remake, like Metal Gear Solid 2, for example, it's like, well, but they just made Metal Gear Solid 5, and maybe they're going to make another one soon, you know? Metroid was a great example again, because when Samus Returns was announced, it was also announced at the same time that Metroid Prime 4 was. So a remake of that game didn't feel lazy because they're clearly already investing time and effort into making the next game. We don't have a confirmation of Resident Evil 8 yet, but I firmly 1000% believe that it's coming sometime soon. In fact, I would expect to see it announced possibly at the Game Awards this year, and if not, then for sure at E3 next year. And so the Resident Evil 2 remake, again, doesn't bother me. Plus, Resident Evil 7 was just 2 years ago. So it's not that Capcom or Nintendo or, well, okay, I'm not going to talk about Konami, but you know what I mean. All of these other companies, they're not ignoring these franchises when they release a remake. They're clearly just deciding to take something nostalgic and put it out there to people. But to play the devil's advocate just a little bit, there is something to be said for, depending on how true to the original remake is, there is a lack of probably planning and structuring that companies have to do when they're making a remake. When you look at Link's Awakening, you know, and I didn't play the original, as you guys know, but I'm familiar enough with it and I've heard enough experts talk about it. You look at Link's Awakening, they obviously didn't have to design a new map, and they didn't have to design new dungeons and puzzles, right? Or at least a lot of them. They clearly were able to take what the same map and layout was and just make it look prettier, and then add some other bells and whistles and stuff here and there. Same with the dungeons. The dungeons existed, the rooms, the puzzles, the contraptions, the items that you get, all these different things. They basically just built it from the ground up, but made it look a little bit better. And so, yeah, that's where you do get a little bit of a gray area, and I can understand to a degree the argument. But again, there are also those games that I think kind of skirt that line the other way. Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes and Samus Returns are great examples, and the original Resident Evil 1 remake are great examples because all of those games feature plenty of new things within them, new gameplay, new areas to explore. I mean, a lot of the Samus Returns map is very different from the original Metroid 2 Game Boy release. So they actually kind of built close to a new map. There are definitely similar areas, but for the most part, well, maybe not for the most part, but for a lot of that part of that map, it was new. They moved things around. They restructured it. And there's plenty of new abilities, the melee attack, and there's new items and new things going on. I mean, they really did a lot. All the Aeon abilities that Samus gets in that game, they changed a significant amount of Metroid 2 to make Samus Returns so that it's not indistinguishable, but it's close to indistinguishable. I mean, at the end of the day, if memory serves me correctly, the closest thing to being reminiscent to Metroid 2 that game has is the simple fact that you're hunting down 40 Metroids to go after and fight the Metroid Queen. That's like the core kind of setup and context of the game is really what's being taken from Metroid 2. So much of the rest of the game is brand new. And so it just is where I guess it comes down to just a back and forth, peas and carrots thing, man. You either see it one way or you see it another way. Overall, I see it as a great thing. I love having remakes to the caliber of Samus Returns and Link's Awakening and Resident Evil 2 in the industry. I always welcome them. I'm trusting most companies right now that aren't Konami, obviously, to still be making new entries in these games and in these series. And speaking of Konami, another fantastic one was Silent Hill Shattered Memories. I'm actually kicking myself for not remembering that. That was a wonderful game. I mean, one of my favorite Silent Hill games, and it's just a reimagining of the original game. So I think that, you know, yes, at the end of the day, a new entry in any given franchise is always ideal. It's always the best. We prefer the sequels to the remakes, yes. But remakes, when handled properly, which I think they usually are are wonderful additions, and I really ultimately don't think that most developers are being lazy. So a bit of a random topic, but I just kind of wanted a think tank conversation piece to get myself back into doing YouTube stuff after taking the week off. And I think it's a really interesting topic. It's very timely and relevant, obviously, because, as I've mentioned several times, with Link's Awakening and Medieval around the corner. And so, I don't know. I'm all about remakes, man. I think it's great. I think it's fun. Keep them coming, man. I mean, if you're going to remake Metroid Prime 1, great. Do it. Give me that game. We all want to play it. No one's going to turn it down, you know? So, what do you guys think? How do you look at remakes? How do you view them? From the perspective of development, how do you view the amount of effort being put into it? And do you think that they're just cheap cash grabs, if I can talk properly? Or do you still see them as something fairly significant that requires a lot of work from the developers? And so that they're not a cash grab, they're actually a real game. That's kind of more how I see them. So whatever you think, talk about it below. Share some of your favorite remakes that you've played out there. If you're excited about Final Fantasy VII, talk about that. And maybe some other remakes that you'd actually like to see. I think that would be a lot of fun as well. So with that, this video is, of course, a wrap. Thanks, of course, as always, for tuning in, guys. This is Rob of Rule of 2 Review, and I'll catch you next time on another video.